Hello, I'm Chris Goodwin with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History. Welcome to this week's streaming-only History is Lunch program, which is sponsored by the John and Lucy Shackelford Charitable Fund of the Community Foundation for Mississippi. We're working safely with the skeleton crew from our home, the Craig H. Nielsen Auditorium in the Museum of Mississippi History and Mississippi Civil Rights Museum. The Eudora Welty House and Garden, in partnership with the Eudora Welty Foundation, will have an heirloom plant sale on Saturday, April 17th, beginning at 9 a.m. and lasting until about 1 p.m. or until the plants are gone. Put that on your calendars, as well as on Thursday, April 22nd at 5 p.m., the Welty House, in partnership with the Visiting Writer Series at Millsaps College, will host an outdoor poetry reading and book signing with Mississippi Poet Laureate Beth Ann Fennelly. You can find more details about both events on the department's website, the Welty House website, or the Welty House Facebook page. And I hope that you'll join us next week for History's Lunch when Crystal Sanders will present After Freedom Summer, the Child Development Group of Mississippi and the ongoing fight for Black freedom. Today, we are delighted to have Farris Rosen to present A Journalist on the Frontlines of the Civil Rights Movement. Farris Rosen is adjunct professor at the University of Maryland's Philip Merrill College of Journalism. She holds a BA in English from Rhodes College and an MA from St. Louis University's Center for Urban Studies. An award-winning freelance journalist, Rosen has worked for the New York Times, Washington Post, and Pew Research Center, and she worked with her father, the reporter John N. Herbers, on his memoir, Deep South Dispatch, published by University Press of Mississippi. Ann will join us via Zoom from Maryland. You can ask your questions of her in the comments of this video, and we'll put them to her at the appropriate time. Now, welcome Farris Rosen.
Thank you very much. I'm so delighted to be here. I was born in Jackson, so it feels like a real homecoming. I just wish I could be at the Welty House for the plant sale and the poetry reading. But I also want to thank the Mississippi Department of Archives and History and Chris Goodwin and his staff for making this possible today. As he said, I collaborated with my father on this memoir. My father began his career as a newspaper man in Greenwood, Mississippi, and he wrote for the Jackson Daily News and the United Press International in Jackson before joining the New York Times, where he worked for another 22 years. So I call him the Forrest Gump of journalism. He was at the most seminal moments in contemporary American history. There was the civil rights movement that he covered for more than a decade, but he went on to be the national reporter for the New York Times, and he covered Vietnam protests, urban riots. He was at the violent 1968 Democratic Presidential Convention. He covered presidential campaigns, including that of Robert F. Kennedy. He was about 50 feet away from Bobby Kennedy when he was assassinated in Los Angeles in 1968. My father went on to be the White House reporter for both President Richard Nixon and President Gerald Ford. He covered Watergate, and he wrote the infamous Nixon resigned article for the front page of the New York Times. So he had quite a career. This book covers only the civil rights movement, but it is chocked with plenty of Gump moments. And I'm going to start by showing a 3-minute video that gives you sort of an overview of the book. It only mentions some of the events he writes about, but it gives you a pretty good example of his presence at all of these.
A young reporter witnesses landmark civil rights uprisings in the segregated South he calls home. Yes, it upends the country, but it also shakes his consciousness, shakes his own world.
He began working as a newspaper reporter in Mississippi in 1949.
This is the story of John Herbers, a journalist for the New York Times and United Press International, whose assignment for more than a decade was to report on the civil rights movement in the Deep South.
Certainly it's a scene that nobody likes to see.
He reported on the brutal execution of Willie McGee, a black truck driver in Mississippi convicted of raping a white woman.
It received national and international news coverage.
And the murder trial of Emmett Till.
There had been other incidences like this in Mississippi beforehand, but this one shook the nation.
He interviewed icons such as Martin Luther King Jr.,
We've gone too far now to turn back.
Robert Kennedy, and John Lewis.
This man here helped tell the story.
Who decades later met with Herbers again.
Thank you for all you did. Thanks,
He took readers behind the scenes of the KKK, and he revealed the private grief of the parents of the 4 black girls who were killed in the Birmingham church bombing. And at his own personal risk, he covered the famous Freedom Summer murders, the riots in St. Augustine,
state officers had to use their police baton,
and the marches in Selma. In his book, Deep South Dispatch, Memoir of a Civil Rights Journalist, John Herbers offers vivid first-hand accounts of seminal events in the history of our country. His vulnerability as a journalist allows readers to see how one man can remain dedicated to his Southern family and heritage, but also dedicate his work to exposing and rejecting the prescribed laws and mores of a prejudiced society. Upon hearing the not guilty verdict from an all-white jury in the Emmett Till murder trial, he wrote,
I felt a nagging feeling in the pit of my stomach. I hunched over the steering wheel and cried. I couldn't stop and cried for many miles. I wanted to cry out of my very core.
I was born a black boy. My name is Emmett Till.
His retrospective is a timely and critical reflection on America's current racial dilemmas and ongoing quests for justice.
Came across for justice to be finally fulfilled. All because of me, a black boy. My name is Emmett Till.
So he wrote his memoir 25 years ago, but it was half finished and relegated to the bottom drawer of a file cabinet. About 15 years ago, I unearthed the memoir, dusted it off, and suggested that we complete it. He was not as excited about it as I was. He was 73 at this point, and I think more interested in retirement. But I went and unearthed a trove of more than 600 of his articles that he had written, and these were only up to 1965, to just focus on the civil rights period. And then he and I worked side by side to produce the second half, and we finished it, luckily, a year before he died in 2017. 6 weeks after my mother died. And she was an incredible woman. She's a big part of this story. He couldn't have had the career he had without her. So even though the book is a historic retrospective, it's relevant today because we are witnessing our own racial reckoning not seen since the 1960s. And as a native son of the South, his personal transformation of his views on race may mirror what some people are experiencing today. So it only seems appropriate for a luncheon like this that we should start with some history. So we have a PowerPoint presentation we're going to watch, and then we'll open it up for comments and questions.
It's the summer of 1964 in St. Augustine, Florida. Claiming to be the oldest city in the United States, the resort beachside town is in a festive mood to celebrate its 400th anniversary. However, a group of civil rights activists, including Martin Luther King, also think it's a good time to bring attention to the fact that the city is so segregated by Jim Crow laws that Blacks can't swim at white public beaches, eat at white restaurants, or read at public libraries. Despite its quaint streets historic buildings and fine old families, the city displayed the vilest form of racism. It was a stronghold for the right, who compared the civil rights movement to communism. The sheriff officially deputized white supremacists and KKK members to keep the peace. So by King's appraisal, St. Augustine was the perfect staging ground for a boycott because he knew he could get the most visceral and violent reaction from law enforcement toward nonviolent protesters. That would make for good media coverage to reach the nation and the congressmen who were on the verge of voting that summer for the Civil Rights Act. My father was assigned to cover the boycotts for the New York Times. This is one of his articles. There were marches, arrests, and beatings of protesters that lasted for months. This is one of his articles describing how black and white protesters violated the city law by swimming in a motel pool. The man jumping into the pool is a sheriff deputy who wanted to forcibly remove them. The motel owner finally poured mercuric acid in the pool to force them out. The protesters returned the next day, and the owner set loose alligators in the pool. King was arrested there for trying to eat at the motel restaurant. My father had been there for 6 weeks when he told his editors he needed to return to his home in Atlanta to take his wife and 4 daughters on a long-planned weekend vacation to the beach. When he arrived in Atlanta, we were standing in the driveway in our bathing suits, flip-flops, and floaties. We were ready to go. While he was packing the car, the New York Times called and said, "Get back to St. Augustine. The beach house where Martin Luther King is staying was firebombed again." So riots or no riots, we went to the beach. He loaded us in the car and we drove to St. Augustine, where my father put us up in a motel on the beach outside of town, away from the protests. That's me to the right of my mother, looking a bit dubious about the whole affair. The vacation was fine, except for not seeing my father very much until the 3rd night. We were awakened in the middle of the night by the sound of roaring trucks outside our window. When I looked outside, I saw men hanging from their pickup trucks, firing their pistols and rifles into the air. None of us was injured. They simply wanted to scare us, and they did. My parents loaded us into our turquoise Chevy sedan and drove us back to Atlanta in the middle of the night. And my father returned the next day. So how did a nice Southern girl like me end up in a place like this? By all measures of demographics and heritage, I should not have been there. I was the daughter of a nice Mississippi country boy from a fine, upstanding family. They were well educated and well respected in the community. In fact, my father's great-grandfather, pictured here, had been a doctor and a pharmacist and also a Confederate captain in the Civil War, and that was quite prestigious. My father had been taught by the church, by the laws, by his family, that segregation was entrenched and accepted, that blacks were inferior to whites, and that blacks were biblically sanctioned to serve whites. He didn't question the status quo. Few people questioned it. But after he left home to fight in World War II and attend college, he began opening his eyes to a larger world. When he returned home to Mississippi to become a newspaper reporter, he started seeing the South in a different light. And I just realized that the cartoon character's profile is in the shape of Mississippi. He questioned his surroundings even more when he was assigned to cover the 1951 electrocution of Willie McGee, a black Mississippi truck driver convicted of raping a white woman. There was little evidence of a rape, and word around town is that their relationship was consensual. And yet McGee was convicted and sentenced to death. At that time, Mississippi had a traveling electric chair they would erect in a courthouse with an electric cord extended out the window to a generator in a nearby truck. Here's my father's description of what he saw. By 10 p.m., more than 500 people had gathered inside the courthouse. Most were men, some sitting in lawn chairs who mumbled and laughed as they waited. The weather was pleasant and the scene festive. Boys and young men climbed to the top limbs of tall trees around the courthouse for a better view through open windows. I pushed my way forward to the front of the crowd. "Let's everybody be nice," a highway patrolman standing on the concrete courthouse steps said to calm the crowd. When he announced that McGee was going to die, everyone shouted a cheerful glee. "We want no demonstrations," the patrolman said. "You have been patient a long time." Those of us outside knew the execution had begun when the generator loudly kicked into gear. A cheer went up among the crowd around me. I felt sick as blood washed from my face. The guards loaded McGee's listless body into a gurney, and the crowd cheered again when the black funeral home attendants carted the body, covered with a white sheet, to a black hearse outside the courthouse. The attendants appeared frightened, and law enforcement officers pushed the crowd back. I looked around me and thought how barbaric the scene was. There seemed to be an inordinate amount of cruelty in those times, perhaps because people had just come out of the brutality of World War II. But whatever the reason, the meanness was so immediate that it resonated deeply with me. 5 years later, my father covered the murder trial of Emmett Till, a 14-year-old black boy visiting Mississippi from Chicago who allegedly wolf whistled at a white woman. Again, my father was transformed by witnessing these mockeries of justice. And so you heard him read the portion of his book where he wrote that after hearing the not guilty verdict, I wanted to cry Mississippi out of my very core. But he stayed for another decade, continuing to question, and as any good reporter does, the precepts of society. And he writes in his book, "At times it seemed the entire state of Mississippi was racist, and that everyone around me believed something different from what I did. I would rise every morning and ask myself, is there something wrong with me?" But he held a strong moral conviction that his role in life was to bear witness and tell the world. His conversion was an evolutionary process. All the while, he was holding on to his Mississippi heritage and somehow reconciling these two contradictions. And over time, as we see now, his impressions and instincts were proven right. James Baldwin wrote, "History is not the past, it is the present. We carry our history with us. We are our history." This can never be more true than today. Scenes of bigotry and violence are reminiscent of 60 years ago. Unfortunately, hate has reared its ugly head once again. So where are we today, and what can we learn from our history? So you'll need to indulge me with a bit more retrospection. There have been 3 major attempts in this country to right the wrongs wrought by slavery. First, there was a strong drive by small farmers during the 1800s to bar the importation of slaves from abroad. Their motive was to curtail the growth of the large plantations that were dependent on slave labor. The United States did abolish the international slave trade, but it did nothing to curtail the domestic trade. So essentially, this amounted to 2 steps forward and 1 step back. The second attempt was a post-Civil War Reconstruction, which brought major advancements for Black people, including the right to vote. 1,500 African Americans were elected nationally during Reconstruction. This change was particularly remarkable in Mississippi. A year after Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, 90% of Black men registered to vote in Mississippi for the first time. That compared to 81% of whites. So not only the percentages, but the numbers of Black voters was higher than white voters in Mississippi by 20,000. Within a few years, 200 Black people were elected to public office in Mississippi, including 2 U.S. senators, one who was born a slave. It's pretty amazing when we don't have anything close to that today. So here you can see a collage of Mississippi lawyers, and it includes the two senators. They're flanked on either side of the state capitol building. There's also a U.S. congressman, Mississippi Secretary of State, Mississippi House Speaker, and Lieutenant Governor. But this period of enlightenment and reparation didn't last long. There was a backlash. They were gaining too much power, and it was another example of 2 steps forward, 1 step back. Then President Andrew Johnson and Congress abandoned Reconstruction before it was completed. And by 1869, only 716 Union troops remained in Mississippi. And 6 years later, whites stole the election through fraud and intimidation. Blacks were systematically deprived of their civil rights, and Black officials were even impeached. Jim Crow laws and violence also resulted in a decline in Black voters that you can see here. This wasn't only limited to the South. Sentiments of white superiority swept the nation in the early 1900s. In 1925, 40,000 members of the Ku Klux Klan held a parade in Washington, D.C. It was lauded by the Washington Post at the time. And many of the Confederate statues that are controversial today were erected during this period as an affirmation and reinforcement of white power and supremacy. The previous chart in this map shows that nearly 2,000 Confederate statues were erected. Most of those were in 1916. These are some of the well-heeled ladies who paid for the monuments and statues. They were members of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. This particular group is a Washington state chapter. So the third movement came with Martin Luther King. He was a reluctant 26-year-old minister recruited to lead the civil rights movement. As we know, it brought major national legislation that forever changed our country. But our lack of perseverance and vigilance since then to uphold the standards of that legislation has left us with a list of systemic institutional inequalities in our schools, our legal system, and the wealth gap. We find ourselves left again with advancing 2 steps forward, 1 step back. So now we are smack dab in the middle of a 4th movement for racial justice. Trayvon Martin, Michael Brown, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, and too many others. They are our new Emmett Tills. The shootings in a South Carolina church and a synagogue in Pittsburgh, those are the new Birminghams. Our elected leaders' support of white hate groups and racial mocking, and the lack of retribution by their supporters mimics the segregationist clarion calls of the 1950s and 1960s. So why now, after the decades-long lull? There's a combination of factors, including new technology that captures the raw videos of atrocities and the decades of complacency I just mentioned. But perhaps the most important reason is just one of pure demographics. In 20 years, whites in an unprecedented time in this country will no longer constitute a majority of the population. People are demanding change, and we are in the midst of a long-deferred reckoning with race. All around us, we see the influence of people of color. We have leaders in every arena: business, arts, academia, sports, government, and politics. I mean, we elected our first Black president, but the images of progress sometimes don't square with the reality, and this puts us in another backlash moment. It's a dynamic time to be alive. It is not easy, but rarely do you find yourself standing in the midst of history, watching it change before your eyes. In closing, I'd like to offer a challenge similar to my father's. What will you tell your children, your grandchildren, you were doing during this historic period? I hope that this book reminds us that through talking with and listening to someone different from us, be it race, political ideology, religion, or locale, we can find common ground. The sharing of stories with integrity fairness, and truth is an integral part of understanding each other and finding a way forward. So I want to thank you, and I think we're going to have time for questions, and I'd love to hear from the viewers as well.
Okay.
Thank you, Ann. That was great. We'll get you back on screen here. There we go. We do have questions. And I want to start with one about you and your father and the experience of working with your father on not just a memoir, but a memoir where he really seems to be extraordinarily candid and straightforward. How was that? And I mean, what roles did you each find for yourselves?
You know, it was an extraordinary time together. It covered almost a period of a decade working on it. I mean, I have a day job, so, you know, I would go over to his house in the evenings or on the weekends, and we would work in that time. It's one reason why it took us so long. But, you know, I think I was made to work with him on this book. Here I had been exposed at a very young age to all of these events. He took my family to KKK marches. I would travel with him on the press planes with presidents when he would go. He'd just take me along sometimes. He and I were tear gassed on the Capitol lawn during a Vietnam protest. So he had really taught me my whole life how to be a journalist and how to be an observer, which was a rare opportunity. And it was almost inevitable I became a journalist myself with that sort of teaching. Like I said, he wasn't as excited about doing the memoir as I was. So I would find these articles and use really the writing from these articles. The New York Times was very gracious in allowing us to reprint most of his work in the book. And the articles caught the immediacy of the moment, caught the color. He even would look at them and say, I don't think I could write this today because they were so impactful at the moment. So I would use a lot of his articles, and then I would go back to him and question him about his own personal memories of that moment, because these articles were for the New York Times. He was a straight, just the facts, ma'am type of reporter. He did not editorialize in these articles. The story was not about him. He never, you know, the newspapers really didn't do as much analysis back then, and particularly he would have never written a personal anecdote at that time. So I had, you know, I wanted to get what his perception was, and he was a very quiet, Southern gentleman, and was not very introspective about this period. So it was like pulling teeth to get him to describe to me what he felt. And, you know, I'd say, well, gosh, this Willie McGee incident, that was horrible. How did you feel about that? He would say, well, that was bad. You know, it was really hard to get him to elaborate. I did find if I put him in front of his typewriter and asked him to type out maybe 4 or 5 paragraphs of what he felt, that he was able to express himself that way. So I would write each chapter in a second half and then take it to him, and he would edit it. And that's how we worked elbow to elbow to complete the second half. So he never saw it in publication, but he did see the, you know, of course, the final manuscript before he died.
Like any good tale of a Southern family, it seems like it has to start with family drama, with mysterious circumstances, with tragedy. And so the very beginning of this book, of this memoir, your father writes about his father and about his childhood and the ways that those things shaped him.
Yes, it almost reads like a Faulkner family. I mean, it's a quintessential Southern family, which really starts in the Victorian period, and how times were so different then, and how there were these very strict codes of honor and personalities and behavior. In this particular case, a very racist status quo. That why would you upset a system that worked for you? Here he was, a white family, and they were probably middle class. They weren't poor, but they weren't richest of the families. And they had very comfortable positions in society. But his family did have a real rebel streak to it. His grandmother in particular, who he didn't know a lot about growing up because the family had kept it a secret. It was a very scandalous affair, and you can read in the book all the scandalous parts of this, but she was ultimately shot, killed by her scorned lover in the lobby of a very prestigious hotel boarding house in Hot Springs, Arkansas. So, he was somewhat of a rebel spirit himself. He might not have gone so far in his personal life to, have affairs or illicit love affairs, but which he did not. But his grandmother had, and you do get a sense of what it was like to grow up in a small town in the South. During the Depression, he described the security and insulation and a cocoon-like atmosphere that nurtured a lot of self-reliance and independence for a little boy running barefoot through, the clover fields behind his house. And he describes the racial situations too. His family were not, mean, horrible racists. They were just like everybody else, most other people, very respectful family, but who adhered to the strict laws of separation and had taught him that blacks were inferior to whites. However, his father owned a series of little stores. He was not a very good businessman. He kept falling out of business and going bankrupt, and they'd move to another town, and he'd start a store there, and he wouldn't do very well either. And my father describes how my grandfather, this is his father, my grandfather, would treat all the customers the same, whether they were black or white. So they were very friendly with blacks, but they still believed in a code of separation.
And your father's father, your father's paternal grandfather, was fairly well-to-do in Memphis by the standards of the time, but your father's father declined to sort of pursue the inheritance from him, and then your father writes about the unintended consequence that he thinks that probably had on his life and his career, that he might not have come to the sort of realizations that he did when he did if he had grown up in a more comfortable middle class or upper middle class life.
Yeah, he says my grandfather, his father, was disinherited from the family because he married outside the Protestant. He married another Protestant. It was just a different denomination. Right. That was considered taboo back then. And so, true, my father never got to reap the rewards of what his father would have inherited. That's one reason why they were always, sort of bordering on lower class, but they were middle class. And he says in the book that it was almost serendipity that he didn't inherit this wealth, that my father might have ended up just carrying on with the very lucrative liquor business in Memphis, Tennessee, and his father probably would have done that, and he would have also inherited that role in life. But that was not to be, and he almost gave thanks for that.
So your father eventually enlists and fights in World War II, and then with the GI Bill, he goes to college, and he had written how in the book he hadn't seriously considered college in the same way before that, but that given the opportunity and the GI Bill as a way to fund it, he chose Emory College, Emory in Atlanta. And I'm curious why he chose Emory and how that experience was for him in the big city of Atlanta at that time.
Right. One reason he had never considered going to college was his family would not have been able to afford it.
Yeah.
So my father said as much as he hated wars and saw the detriment of wartime, there were some benefits. And one of them was, the GI Bill paid for him and other, small town boys like him, and they were almost boys at that point, to go on to college. I have to admit, I don't know why he chose Emory University in particular, or he told me and I forgot. That's a horrible thing to say, but I do know once he got there, going off to war had already opened his eyes. It was the first time he had left the South, and here he goes to the Philippines. He said he met a Yankee for the first time. He really realized it was a much larger world. And at Emory, he really discovered the joy of learning as well. And he met all kinds of different people, including Claude Sitton, who was, at the time, the editor of the school newspaper, but went on to become a very well-known, famous journalist who covered the civil rights movement for the New York Times out of Atlanta, and ultimately became my father's bureau chief in Atlanta. So they were reunited that many years later. But the whole experience of Atlanta gave him so much more wisdom and made him more worldly, which informed his decisions when he returned to Mississippi and saw the atrocities he did of Willie McGee and Emmett Till and many other instances at the time. He looked at it in a new way, with eyes wide open this time.
Yeah. Yeah, he writes, one of the periods of intense personal growth seemed to come during his 20s when he worked at the Jackson Daily News.
Yes, and Jimmy Ward was a reporter at the time. He went on to become the editor and quite notorious for his extremely racist editorials and writing. And it didn't just go away over time. I think the legislature even gave some special recognition to Jimmy Ward, maybe a decade ago. Regardless, it was, he saw the influence that you could have through the press and the power of the pen. Jimmy Ward exercised a lot of influence. My father was just a cub reporter at the time and didn't have as much influence, but when he went on to work for UPI in Jackson, Mississippi, he wielded a lot of influence because he was the bureau chief, right, and was the one to decide what type of coverage they would have for the state. And that included, during my father's tenure, he decided to look at the news of the Black movement that was occurring. It was very young in its first stages, but one of the first stories that he started covering and got a lot of pushback from the subscribers in Mississippi, the subscribers to the United Press wire service, was to go to the church of Aaron Henry in Clarksdale, Mississippi. He took my family with him at the time. I was just a little girl, but I distinctly remember being in this large Black church, and it was a voting rights organizing session that was being held after the church service. My father said he never saw the story. The story never saw the light of day. None of the subscribers wanted a story about blacks organizing for voting rights in Mississippi, but he continued to press to write those sorts of stories.
And then he wound up in the middle of one of the most notorious trials, as you noted, of the 20th century, there when the Emmett Till trial took place. And at the end of that, he seems to have another real moment where he's just sort of gutted by the violent murder, by the failure to convict, by the response of white Mississippi at large to the whole thing.
Yeah, he has a great description of the trial itself and how agonizing it was and what they went through. But at the end of this 5-day trial, he writes, and sitting in that courtroom for 5 days and hearing evidence beyond a doubt that the defendants were guilty, the verdict still shocked me. Tired and angry, I drank a beer and got in my car to drive home to Jackson. How could I explain to Betty, that's my wife, my mother, his wife, how would I explain to Betty and my 2 young daughters that something like this had happened in America, much less in a state we called home? A few miles outside of Sumner, I felt a nagging tug in the pit of my stomach. I was mentally and physically exhausted. And I was also beginning to see that my long indifference to Southern suppression of blacks was as displaced as the motives of those who enforced the suppression. I hunched over the steering wheel and cried. I couldn't stop crying for many miles. I wanted to cry Mississippi out of my very core. And then in the video, of course, you saw him reading this decades later. And this was just the beginning of the things he experienced and saw in the civil rights movement.
One of the other journalists that covered that trial was Bill Miner. We have a question from Galen Mark LaFrancis, who asks if your father was a friend of Bill Miner's.
He was a friend of Bill Miner's, and one of the people who he remained friends with decades after my father left Mississippi. Bill Miner stayed in Mississippi, of course, and they used to laugh about that a lot. And Bill Miner would always joke and, give my father a hard time for fleeing, which is what he would call it. But my father had great admiration for him for remaining in Mississippi and withstanding the same sort of anger and ostracization that my father and mother had experienced when they lived there. But they would oftentimes get together, whether my father was back in Jackson or Mississippi, or whether Bill was in New York to accept an award, or Washington, D.C., and they remained close friends.
And then your father writes that Harding Carter Sr. was another sort of pillar of support for him while he was in Mississippi, especially during those years covering the civil rights movement.
Yeah, Harding Carter was not known just in Mississippi. He was like the equivalent of Anderson Cooper today. He was known all over the country for his writing, and also particularly when he would host a lot of the northern reporters coming to Mississippi not during the Emmett Till trial necessarily, some, but later in a lot of the other events. And so he describes in the book, too, how Harding Carter Sr. many times helped my father keep his bearings straight. And I think, as he said, sometimes wake up and realize I wasn't crazy every day. My father also then later befriended Harding Carter Jr., the son, Harding Carter Sr., who went on to become quite a prestigious journalist himself. Yeah. And they were friends in Washington, D.C. when Harding Carter and his wife lived there as well.
Right. We have another question from the live stream. Shane Peterson asks if your father was ever threatened for writing about the movement, and then also if he had any stories centered on or around Natchez.
Centered around the what?
Natchez, Mississippi.
Oh, Natchez. Yeah. So he says, I'm going to try to find this part where he writes about the danger. He says, my professional decisions, and this is when he was at United Press International, so he was in Jackson and dictating for the news and just from Mississippi. My professional decisions at UPI took a toll on my personal life. I didn't feel I was in physical danger, but Betty and I were ostracized by people in our neighborhood, accused us of being communists. Betty was subjected to snide remarks from women with whom she worked in church or civic affairs. We were reminded that upsetting the apple cart was not a dignified Southern style. We didn't discuss politics or my work with our extended family, who were not SEG, is what they were called, church segregationists, but were conservative and didn't understand why we were willing to risk our reputation and status. Now, I think he's understating this a little bit, although he's writing about when he was in Mississippi. Later, when he went to some of these more violent areas, he does describe being just a hair away from, a billy club hitting him over the head, or
Right.
in one instance, a car tried to run him over. He was threatened by mobs of KKK members or white supremacists. And in one instance, the police, told him they could no longer protect him and told him he needed to get out of town. He was in St. Augustine specifically. He called his editors and said, my life is in danger here, and I've been told the police will not protect me anymore. And they told him to get out. And they sent in Homer Biggert, who was the most famous war reporter at the time for the New York Times. And it just goes to show you really how dangerous the situation was that they sent in a war reporter. And my father always smarted from that. He said it was the only time he ever fled from an assignment. And he didn't regret it. He needed to get out, but he didn't like the idea that he had to not complete the assignment yet. And I'm sorry, and Natchez, that was the other.
Oh, yes,
sorry.
Natchez, yeah.
So no, he didn't address Natchez, although he talked about the Natchez Trail, which runs through Natchez, the highway there, and the significance of it historically, and what it meant for that whole region to bring people of differing types through that part of Mississippi as part of the Commerce Trail as well.
Yeah.
But no, he didn't spend a lot of time specifically in Natchez, Mississippi.
Yeah. Did I hear you mention in a video that your parents and the Everses had dinner not long before Medgar Evers was assassinated?
They did. So my father writes about how they didn't have a lot of friends in their lives because they were ostracized. They didn't belong to any clubs, and they belonged to the church. They had a strong connection there, although they sometimes found themselves moving from church to church when the church got too conservative, or that they felt alienated even within the church. But he says that they did make new friends, and they always had lots of friends who were journalists. But they also made new friends, and one of those was Medgar Evers and his wife. And so one of the reporters there at the UPI Bureau, Cliff Sessions, who went on to become a reporter for ABC News, he was a close friend of my father's, and he invited my parents to come to his apartment in Jackson to have cocktails with Murley and Medgar Evers. It was, of course, segregated neighborhood. It was all whites who lived there, and when the Edgars came, they closed the blinds, drew the blinds, and tried not to make too much of a show that a black couple was coming to socialize. He said it was really a great evening. They talked about baseball and other things besides the civil rights movement. But my father had a great deal of respect for Edgar's intelligence and his compassion. Those were the things he said.
We have a question from Dee Dee Baldwin. Dee Dee has done a great project where she has been tracking the African-American elected officials in Mississippi during the Reconstruction era. And she has a question that is sort of specifically related to that for you, about the collage that you used in your video presentation. I think it was the one that had the attorneys and senators from Mississippi listed. She's curious where that came from and where she might find it.
I did a lot of research with the Mississippi Department of Archives and History, so I want to thank you all for all the information you've cataloged. But I went to the New Civil Rights Museum, and I believe that's where I found that. Gosh, I did so much stuff. I think that's where I saw it. I also wanted to say that maybe I saw it in the Mississippi State Capitol, but no, I gave a lecture there, but I think it was the Civil Rights Museum. But if you don't find it, let me know and I'll figure out.
We'll make sure y'all are put in touch for that
Yeah, it was so emblematic of the power that was gained in such a small amount of time.
Right.
By Black Americans, some of whom had been slaves at that time.
There's a great video online of a 2014 reunion between your father and Congressman John Lewis. How did that come about?
Yeah, so two of my sisters, I think, are here today, and one of them, and she and her husband, who's a criminology professor, and she teaches African American history in Florida. It just came up with this great idea that they should call John Lewis and get them together, which they did. John Lewis was ever gracious in his time and resources. And so this is an assisted living facility where my parents lived in Washington, D.C. And John Lewis came with his aide and really spent an inordinate amount of time with my dad. And they really had a reunion. It was the first time they had seen each other since, oh gosh, I know my father, I saw the two of them together when John Lewis's memoir, Into the Wind, was published. So maybe that was a decade before. So they had seen each other since Selma, but not often. And this was the last time they saw each other. Yeah. And it's described in the book in the final chapter. It's a lovely scene.
Yeah, it's a great video to see and just to hear them sort of reminiscing, reflecting, and catching up. So it seems to me that you have a really interesting spot, almost a bridge between several generations of journalists and budding journalists. And I wonder what your thoughts are on sort of the ways that the field has changed, what it has been able to accomplish, what you think it needs to focus on at the moment?
Yeah, boy, journalism has changed so much, just in the last 20 years even, and much of it is the technology.
Yeah.
The atrocities we see now in the news were happening within the Black community for a long time. But suddenly, you don't have to be a reporter for the New York Times anymore to capture what is happening in America. And so here we have regular citizens, unfortunately, witnessing and documenting some horrible atrocities toward Blacks in America. And people are demanding change, and lots of people have a strong voice now. The gatekeepers of the past, the traditional media outlets, which are still around, New York Times, Washington Post, all the, and now CNN and NBC, all the networks, they're still there, but they are now being joined by a variety of voices. And it really has taken on a new complexion for America and forced people, I think, to become aware of what's happening. And there tends to be sometimes inaccurate reporting or a sensationalizing of the reporting. But, if you go to the right sources and good, reliable sources, you really do get a full picture of what is happening in America. So I know that journalism is on the decline. I think the journalism that's on decline is the old school journalism. And there is a whole new golden age of journalism happening right now. And my students, wow, they are so hopeful of what they can do and what they plan to do. There's a lot more, I see a lot more advocacy journalism in their feelings, particularly compared to what my father displayed, which was, he claimed he was not an advocate. I've had other people, counter that with me and say, no, the fact that he even continued to cover all these events proves he was an advocate. But my students tend to see journalism as a mechanism for real change and their voices being heard. So it's really a dynamic time.
It's really interesting to think about, especially when he was at UPI, University Press, that they didn't write op-eds, that they did write straight news. He talks about in one part of Deep South Dispatch how he wrote a story on Ross Barnett's victory as governor and referred to him as an aging segregationist. And someone complained about that, and when he thought about it, that he probably should have left aging off, but that it was almost a code word, a signal to folks outside the state.
I was looking for this one portion of the book where he really describes it well. He says, people asked me how I could watch the atrocities during the civil rights movement without taking a more vocal position. I believe a good reporter is an observer who stands in the corner observing as much as he can to be heard or seen, but never becoming partisan. All reporters must leave the corner to search for the truth. But once it is found, offload the material to editorial writers and other sections of society to reckon with. The search for truth requires an objective seeker, especially when that search goes against public opinion. A dedicated reporter can spend a lifetime finding the truth without becoming an advocate in the public arena. And he talks about, had he not maintained his credibility, it would have made him less powerful, and he would not have represented the New York Times well. So he thought his credibility came with objectivity, and that he would lose his credibility if he were not objective. And I think that can be true even today when we have, highly opinionated news broadcasting, whether it's from Fox News or MSNBC, either way. At some point, people don't, take those news outlets as seriously as if someone just gave them the news.
Yeah, he writes about, in the book, at one point, his desire to start a weekly newspaper in Mississippi, which I think probably does speak to his commitment to pursuing the sorts of stories that he thought were important.
Yeah, I think he just got frustrated also with, he never got pushback from UPI and his editors in Atlanta for any of the articles he wrote. But I think he thought he might find a greater voice. I mean, there were others in Mississippi who had great reporters who won Pulitzer Prize, Ira, and Helen, why am I not coming up with her name? Anyway, that's Carol, those in the past.
Brannon Smith, Hazel Brannon Smith.
Hazel Brannon Smith, thank you. Their papers eventually were run into the ground. Because of the stance they took. I don't think that is what dissuaded him. Harding Carter somewhat dissuaded him and said, this is a big undertaking. You need to know what you're getting into. And he didn't pursue it. But
we've come right to the top of another hour, but I want to ask one last question. After working with your father on this project, how do you feel about Mississippi? Do you have many memories of Mississippi? Do you feel like a Mississippian, having been born here? Do you Do you feel differently about the state having sort of looked at it through this lens of your father's work here?
Yeah, I mean, I have great memories in Mississippi. My family lived there, I had aunts and uncles, and so we would return a lot. And I've been back on, research and things like that. Whenever I would go north, and I lived in St. Louis, I live in Washington, D.C. now, I lived in New York for a while, I found that there was racism and segregation of it may not have been a Jim Crow law of different types. And I don't think that Mississippi or the South was unfairly targeted to change its laws and to grapple with its racial problems. But I think that the nation doesn't give them credit for having seized those problems and in many ways moved on beyond where some places in the North have moved on. So I think I look at Mississippi now and I think about what a model almost it can be for other parts of the country, whether it's Minneapolis or, we see in a lot of these cities, there are similar problems. So, I know Mississippi still has a long way to go, as do a lot of places in this country. But sometimes I think there's not enough credit given for what they've overcome.
Yeah, the work done, the distance traveled.
Right.
Well, thank you all for watching. Remember the events coming up at the Welty House. Remember to join us next week for History's Lunch with Crystal Sanders. And Farris Rosen, the book is Deep South Dispatch. Thank you for this and the work of your father, and we'll look forward to more with you and from you in the future.
Thank you very much.